It is imperative that the Trail of Tears Association ensure that the record of what was done to the First Nations of the southeastern United States remains as relevant a story today as it was 180 years ago.
An amazing story that the people, the ancestors of the Eastern Band, purposefully enacted and saw their way all the way through all the suffering that it took to remain here.
The Cherokee wanted to create, they wanted to communicate with themselves, but most importantly, they wanted to communicate with the world.
So ancestral Cherokee people are cosmopolitan people. They had deep and wide social networks.
One disillusioned soldier wrote that he was paid to commit a crime, to defend a fraudulent treaty with, in his words, the vilest machinations man or demon could invent.
And if you understand the Trail of Tears, and if you don't forget the Trail of Tears, when you go on to study just what happened in the 19th century after the Cherokee people got to their new homelands, picked themselves back up, and rebuilt a great society and a great democracy and a government built on the rule of law.
We don't do this to shame or blame. We do it because it's an opportunity for us to say to the world, our ancestors persevered. They had tenacity and resilience. They refused to be victims. They rebuilt the Cherokee Nation.
So I think that y'all should give yourselves a round of applause for all that you've accomplished in the last 25 years.
You didn't sign up to be warriors in this battle. Your efforts to speak plainly about the Trail of Tears, to preserve the history, helps push back on this nonsense. So we are bringing back the history course for the Cherokee people, by the Cherokee people, so that this generation of Cherokees coming up will know their own history.
Thank you, Yona, and we should have given you a shorter bio there. I think that was one for the Cherokee Nation. And I'm really honored, feel honored to be with you all here tonight to address the Trail of Tears Conference and the Eastern Band community, which is a real treat for me, because I always like to see what we do brought back into the community. Now I want to start first by remembering my good friend and colleague, T.J. Holland, who has walked on since the last time we were able to get together here. TJ held everything together. I can't just recite everything that TJ did. Some of you might know him as the manager of Junaluska Museum, cultural resources manager for the tribe, but he was much, much, much more to the Eastern Band and to his family and the people who knew him well. And he seemed to know everyone well. Having lost TJ is just immeasurable. It's an immeasurable loss to the tribe and to me personally. What I'm going to do tonight is talk about some research that TJ worked on along with me and our good friend and colleague Lance Green. And Lance's book, if you don't have it yet, you need to get it, because it talks about much of these same stories, but much more coherently than I will. But TJ had a hand in all of this. TJ was into all, for those who knew him, he was into far more than you could possibly imagine behind the scenes, working with museums and organizations across the country. So we really miss TJ. And as I have there at the bottom, we will see him again. We will see TJ again. So our title for tonight is whatever risk they might run. Cherokee responses to removal in North Carolina. Because in North Carolina, the removal played out quite differently than in the other areas of the Cherokee Nation. And I want to look at why that is. And the fact that it played out differently is why the Eastern Band is here today. So the Eastern Band has a different arc during removal. I've heard people say, I don't know why the Eastern Band would be interested in Trail of Tears because they didn't take the walk. But in fact, the very genesis of the Eastern Band is associated with removal and the Trail of Tears. It is their story, the Eastern Band's story as well. And there are very specific reasons that people did not go to the West when everything came down. And I want us to look at those. This is a huge story and a very complicated story, and I'm going to try not to tell it in real time and recite all of that. But I want to hit some of the high points and give you a structure for what went on. And then there will be other talks during the conference, certainly by Lance Green and Bill Dragowski and others that will sort of expand on these. So I just try to set the stage for them and what they do. So the title comes from George Fanshaw's journal. Fanshaw was a British geologist who was touring around in the Cherokee Nation, and he went into the Valley River Valley. He started in past Andrews there in August of 1837, and he ran into a Cherokee named John Welch. And John Welch didn't want to talk to Fanshaw, and with good reason. Fanshaw was actually a spy for the U.S. government. He was taking names. But what Welch did tell him, he said that the Cherokees are determined not to abandon their country, whatever risk they might run. And that's more than prophetic. So despite the scope and scale of this forced deportation in 1838 and 1839, in 1840 there were over 1,000 Cherokee people who remained in the Cherokee homelands, and most of those were in North Carolina. That persistence of Cherokee people in their homelands was not coincidental. It wasn't ad hoc. In fact, it was intentional and strategic. It was actually part of a long-term process that people didn't see going on at the time, but it was planning. It was the same principal characters all the way through who executed this plan. That plan originated within traditional town structures. It originated in town councils. And the reason that it was executed is these towns wanted to create and maintain their autonomy as traditional communities. That resistance was organized within particular families and clans, extended family networks. And those families had developed, I think strategically, ties with certain white people, people who were closely affiliated with those families, people who spoke Cherokee and were dedicated to their cause. And they used those people as proxies in their plans. Sometimes people think that these Yunegs originated these plans. That's not the case. They were operatives who were sent out to do things. And there's this long narrative, this dominant narrative that, the folks in North Carolina were just the runaways who went and hid in the mountains until finally the whole Solly episode had happened and that was cleared away. But that masks what happened. It masks the very purposeful planning and coordination that the people applied to remain in their mountain homelands. So I'm sometimes in talking with Eastern Band groups in particular and young people, the question is posed, well, why didn't we fight back? Why didn't we push back? Why didn't we fight them? And my answer is, you did. You fought in the smartest, most intelligent way possible, and you won. And people don't tell you that. You didn't allow yourselves to be pushed out. There's no accident about that. Now it's a little bit of backstory. And this story begins, as many Cherokee stories do, at Kadua, where in 1816 a council met in October. And that council included some pretty famous Eastern Band progenitors, people like Yonaguski, well-known names that you would recognize. Connaught was there. And they were giving the federal agent down the road. They were reading the federal agent, the Riot Act. And this is a very strongly worded memorial that comes from that. And what they say is, you do not take us for any part of the nation. You're ignoring us, basically. And then they say, we must from that conclude that we are left to do the best we can for ourselves and act accordingly. This is a declaration. This is a declaration issued from Kadua, because they could see what was coming. In 1816, Kadua was up close to the boundary of the Cherokee Nation. It had once been out in the center, but because of various land cessions, it was now on the edge. And in 1819, they felt like they'd been thrown under the bus. The people around Kadua in the Tuckasegee River Valley and the Little Tennessee River Valley lost their lands to this land cession, an enormous land cession. It took half of the Cherokee lands in North Carolina and much in Tennessee and Alabama as well. And so they were faced with the loss of their homes and their beloved towns. So you can see from 1820 right up through 1838, Kadua and the communities that were up here on the Tuckasegee and Oconaluftee rivers were outside the nation. But that treaty had a specific clause, Article 2, in which the United States allowed a reservation of 640 acres for each head of family that registered their name for the agent and who chose to become citizens of the United States in the manner stipulated. And then people went to register their names. In fact, far more than the federal government ever anticipated. Hundreds of people registered their names for reserves across the ceded areas. 75 in North Carolina. 75, including our friend John Welch there. Okay, so he's in on this. And Will noting, there's his plat. There's Will Note's plat from Deep Creek there. In fact, we have a list of 75 reservees in North Carolina. And if you look, those highlighted, those are all people who signed that memorial at Kadua. What they are doing is exactly what they said. They are doing for themselves. Oops, I back up. And then those highlighted in blue are names I want you to take note of. There's John Welch, our friend, Gideon Morris, who is his neighbor, and Ujala. So they're all reservees. They're all in on this program. 49 of these reserves were platted out and surveyed. And you can see it's a huge area in western North Carolina. If all 75 had been platted out, that would be 48,000 acres. That would be almost as big as Qualla Boundary. That's how much land they were reserving. And these reserves were clustered up. And what we can tell from the limited documentation, but really the way these folks were acting, is while the United States intended this to be land that people held as private farms and plantations, that's not really what they were doing at all. What they were doing is putting this land together for their communities. There were actually hundreds of people who lived out there on that land in the cluster of Kadua. So this is the way they're maintaining land bases for traditional communities, communal land bases. We see the same thing south at Cowee. Now these are areas that we're going to be passing through tomorrow. We're going to go visit Cowee. We're going to end up at Kadua. We're going to be on those reserves. And look at some of the names we see here. These are people who become principals in the resistance against the forced deportation. People like Ujala, John Welch, Katadihi, the Axe. Had this worked, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The Eastern Band would have formed in 1820, with a land base, actually really good land, by the way. But the states of North Carolina and Tennessee, Georgia and Alabama refused to acknowledge this clause of the federal treaty, and they surveyed all the way across all those reserves and sold those lands. And like North Carolina, they passed statutes that whoever bought these lands could throw whoever was living on them off. And so almost every Cherokee family in North Carolina lost their lands by 1821. So this plan sort of implodes. These people are kicked off, and so what do? Well, the folks up here on the Tuckasegee and Oconaluftee rivers, they stay here. They have some allies who can buy land, and they live on some sort of unsold lands in land cession. The people south of the Cowie Mountains, those in Macon County, they all move back into the nation, sort of slinking into the nation, because they are technically citizens of the United States now, technically. But people didn't take this laying down. Here's a whole group of people, most of whom are monolingual Cherokee speakers. They only speak Cherokee, but they secure legal representation at the direction of Gideon Morris, our friend who shows up there, who's white and sort of an ad hoc lawyer. And they take these people who push them off their lands, and they take the state of North Carolina to court. And they pursue their cases in every court that they can, and they go all the way up to the North Carolina Supreme Court. In 1824, the case of Ujula versus Welch, not John Welch, but another white guy named Welch, is heard in the North Carolina Supreme Court. And Chief Justice Taylor makes a ruling in that. And he said that the only manner stipulated in the Treaty of 1817 about them becoming citizens is they signed the register. So they're automatically citizens. And he said that they took reserves, they'd signed the register, so they took reserves not as Cherokee citizens, but as American citizens, and their rights to property should be upheld as American citizens. This is a ruling of the highest court in the state of North Carolina. Now, they can't restore this land, or they don't want to, I guess. But the state of North Carolina has to reach monetary settlements with all the reservees, and they go through and do that. So now this whole group of people has a legal status in North Carolina, as well as a status of, that doesn't keep them from being Cherokee folks. They still have clan, they still have Cherokee families. But now they have this special status in North Carolina. And this is a program that people keep in their minds for the next 2 decades, all the way through to the time of the Cherokee removal. So we're going to jump forward now from 1824 to 1828, and this rascal gets elected. Just 4 years after that ruling. And of course, we know Jackson's agenda is to push, to dispossess all the native peoples east of the Mississippi and to push them to the west. And that's a program that he pursued throughout his 2 terms of presidency. He got the removal bill passed, and that gave him the cover to act. Ultimately, in 1835, we know that his agents, his minions, really pull over what is a truly fraudulent treaty on the Cherokee people. They negotiate not with the regularly elected government, but in fact with a secondary group of leaders, and they say these are actually the legitimate government. Okay, so it's just a small fraction, and there are so few people in attendance that it really shouldn't carry through. John Ross leading the national government, of course, they put up a valiant legal effort against this treaty and the ratification of this treaty in U.S. Congress, but Congress is going to ratify this treaty. Jackson is pushing it as hard as he can, no matter what Ross and Lowry and the lobbyists that they have in Washington, D.C. are doing. And they do push this through Congress. So in May of 1836, Congress ratifies that treaty, and that consigns the Cherokee Nation to immigration, total immigration to the West within 2 years. Jack Skeena there, looking pretty rough, I'll have to say. He modified that treaty. He took the treaty that was signed at New Echota and he struck out clauses. He modified it to the way he wanted before it went to Congress. And one of the things he did is he took out a reservation clause. There was a clause in there that people could stay and take preemptions of 160 acres around their homes. And Jackson hated the reservation clause. In fact, he said that Lowry and Ross and all those guys weren't legitimate Cherokees because they had taken reserves. Of course, they're putting that spin on it. But they left in the rest of that article, which is Article 12, and you said those individuals and families that are averse to removal and want to become citizens of the United States where they reside are entitled to receive their due portion. It leaves the door open for people to remain. Of course, they don't mean this. The federal government doesn't mean this, but that little clause is stuck in there. And that is the clause that then becomes very important to the folks in North Carolina who stay behind. They send this guy, William Holland Thomas, the Cherokee folks here in Qualla. Okay, this was all called Qualla Town at the time. And the folks who were up here, Yonaguska, Will Nody, and those folks, they have an agent, William Holland Thomas. Now, Thomas, this guy, Little Willie Oosty, okay, who was described as a very busy little man, and if you read his journals, he was very busy. The father of Western North Carolina in more ways than one. But they had sent Will up to D.C. Now, he reports later on, late in life, that Yonaguska had actually adopted him. And he had grown up around here and spoke Cherokee. And so if that was a serious claim, then he was an adoptive relative of the folks in Qualla, of the Yonaguska's family. We don't know if that was for real, but, part of what we do in a court case is we get to motivation. And so there's some motivation there. Well, what Thomas does is he goes up and he's trying to get in the supplemental articles a provision for the communities of Qualla, Alarka, Equani, Stikoa, and Chioa to be permitted to remain. That all the people on the northern side, and that he would represent them. And he's doing that with reference to the 12th article of the Treaty of New Echota. Congress isn't going to go for that. They're not going to go for like this big blanket thing. But he does present evidence for the people in Qualla who have been outside the nation and evidence of their citizenship in North Carolina. And so he finally gets permission, if they have a list positive, a list certain, of the people who are to remain signed, and then the Cherokee Committee signs off on that. So this group, 333 people, led by, I bet there's a pointer here, and who knows what's going to happen. There, right there. Yonaguska, Long Blanket, Will Nody, and a lot of names that are, still prominent here on the Eastern Band. Will Nody, Connaught, Arneach, a lot of the family names that we know here. They are now granted citizenship under Article 12. But these are the folks who live outside the nation. But that plan then extends beyond that, back into the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation, and you see people like Wachacha. Remember, TJ is a descendant of Wachacha, and I'm going to come back to that. But Wachacha is also Yonaguska's nephew. So this thing is running out through that family. It says Mr. Thomas told Wachacha that they were advised to go to New Echota, get your permission to remain, but stay in the nation. And so there were a lot of families down there, in what's now Cherokee County and Clay County, mostly Cherokee County and Graham County, who got their permits to remain. So they think they're secure. But now the Army doesn't know about these. And the Army's not paying any attention to these when push comes to shove. And it's in this context that Welch says that to Fanshawe. I'll just remind you, whatever risk they might run. At the same time then, in 1836 and 37, the Army is ramping up its presence in the Cherokee Nation because they don't anticipate that any of the Cherokee Nation is going to comply to the treaty. Ross has started a program of, folks would say passive resistance, but basically they're not going to acknowledge this fraudulent treaty. Preparing to immigrate would mean that you acknowledge that this is a valid thing, and they're not going to do that because it's not. It's a lie. If you participate in a lie, you're a liar. So they're not going to do that. And the U.S. Army, on the orders of the War Department, puts everything in place to execute a forced deportation of the Cherokee people. We all know about that. Ellis Wool, I put this over because he's just got the most amazing comb over, Want to just see that. He's in an expedition to North Carolina where they're trying to force people to comply to the treaty. He actually confiscates people's guns, just out of the blue. And later he says, I was wrong about that. Here, let me give this stuff back to you. But people are now beginning to feel the presence of the Army. And he establishes a whole system of forts, or begins the establishment of a system of forts throughout the Cherokee Nation. So you end up with a network of Army garrisons positioned across the Cherokee Nation for that moment. And here's where they're located in North Carolina. And we're going to be on this road between Fort Lindsay and Camp Dudley there tomorrow. And you can see where Caddo is relative to that. I got to throw this in. This was like the best thing that I found. So the commander of troops in North Carolina, he pulls everybody in the fort that's near Andrews. And he says, look, guys, y'all got to get ready to leave. We're here right now. We're your friends, and we're helping keeping everybody off your lands. But when that treaty deadline expires, we're going to arrest you and march you out of here. So pack up your stuff and get out of here. Don't make us do this. Everybody leaves. They don't want to hear this. They don't want to hear this. John Welch and Old Hog or Gwelsatihi are there. And they leave too. And Powell brings them back in. And he says, okay, Ross is in Washington. He's trying to renegotiate this treaty. But he's not going to get this done. It's too late. He's not going to get this done. What are you going to do if this happens? And what Welch says, he says, Welch replied that he would go to Washington City himself, whip Ross, and do the business. Conclude the business of the nation. Those are very, very strong words. That's not something that somebody just throws out idly. So that sort of establishes character. We don't really know quite exactly who Welch is. Lance Green does a wonderful exploration of that in his book, but he's almost kind of like a godfather or something. He's definitely muscle in there. So the Army sends old Chubby Cheeks Winfield Scott in to take command of all of the Cherokee removal. He arrives in Athens and Fort Cass and then sets up the orders for the expiration of the treaty deadline for the arrests of Cherokees to commence. They commence in Georgia in late May of 1838. They're delayed in North Carolina until June 12th. And I tell people, poor old Tommy Wildcat, he keeps getting arrested over and over and over again in my talks. But June 12th in North Carolina, they begin the arrests of people. And they're grabbing people up in these mountain communities and taking them to these fort stations and then moving them progressively down the road toward the immigration depot. And we see right after that, right after it starts, a communication from Lieutenant Colonel Bynum, and he says, I collected yesterday about 80 Indians. They'd all received orders from Welch on Valley River to leave home and take to the mountains. So that's the first indication that we have an active resistance going on. Welch has ordered people, and whoever he is, he's got enough juice that he can order people and they go. And so they caught people out with orders. And then 5 days later, Captain Porter writes, he says, I've taken post here close to Welch's and Culver's because what the people are being fed and harbored, hidden, and getting information from Welch and Culver. In other words, this is sort of the epicenter of this pushback that's happening. The next time we see John Welch in all this, of course, the Army's set up next to his house watching him, and so people are kind of pulled back. But there's a group that's been taken prisoner, taken into Fort Lindsay. They're marched down this road that we're going to be on tomorrow, right through here. We'll be on it there in Cowee, to Franklin, and then up across the Nantahala Mountains. They get in with another group at Camp Scott until there's about 400 people. And this group includes, by the way, the Standing Wolf, a guy named the Standing Wolf who's the progenitor of a lot of folks in the Eastern Band are related to the Standing Wolf. Jerry Wolf, if you remember, who was a fixture at the museum for years, he was Jerry Standing Wolf, actually. So they come through there, they go through, this is Andrews, and they stop at John Welch's house, where they meet this guy, Preston Starrett. Preston Starrett's a white guy. What the Army doesn't know is his wife is Cherokee. He's a Cherokee countryman. He has been hired by General Nathaniel Smith, the superintendent of immigration, to be the assistant agent. And he's there at Welch's, and instead of signing people up to go out to Oklahoma, what he's doing is he's writing permits to some hundreds of Indians to remain in the country. He's been here for days at Welch's, distributing permissions with a liberal hand. Now everybody has hall passes. Here's one of these permits here for Esagahi. They actually had permission from the War Department to do this, from Commissioner Harris, who gave them permission. What they said is there's 200 old and infirm Cherokees up here. They'll never be able to make the trip. It's inhumane to take them along. So can we have permits for them? And the War Department says, we'll look like bad guys if we don't do that. And they said, well, we also have to have permits for their families because you can't just leave them by themselves. And this now, all of a sudden, this is like hundreds and hundreds of people. Here's one for Big George, which he didn't use. He got taken out to Oklahoma. But you can see it's signed by Nathaniel Smith, superintendent of the Cherokee removal. This guy, who's in charge of troops in North Carolina, rescinds those permits. He confiscates all the permits from the group that Standing Wolf is in. And he sends word down to Fort Cass and to Winfield Scott. Something's up here. I have fired Preston Starrett, but they're up to something. That group travels on then from Fort Butler. They get to Fort Butler on July 4th, and they go all the way down, then along this Unicoi Turnpike Road through Tellico Plains and Athens to Fort Cass. That group of 400 people who had their permits rescinded. And I'm just sort of setting up this date line for you here. So they arrive July 12th to this place, this immigration depot, which turns into the concentration camps of the summer. There's more than 8,000, up to 10,000 Cherokee people there at any one time in these camps. When they get there, I can track one family in particular, Standing Wolf's family. They muster in, and that family then goes down to what's called the Rattlesnake Springs, to those encampments there, and move into that area. About 2 weeks after they've done that, now, pardon me if this is there's too many moving parts here, right? About 2 weeks after they do that, John Welch and his son Ned and Wachacha and Junaluska, who is Wachacha's half-brother, and Gideon Morris, who is the brother-in-law of both of those guys, show up at Fort Cass. They all have permits. They've had permits for months. They come riding their horses into Fort Cass through the gates, and Winfield Scott has them summarily arrested and thrown in the brig. Hempstead, adds Junaluska into the group in this testimony. Johnson Rogers gives testimony later on as to why they were arrested. And he says General Scott said he had had Welch arrested because Ross alleged that Welch was using his influence to prevent the Cherokees from removing to the west. What would John Ross have to do with this? Well, Ross and the nation had entered into an agreement with Winfield Scott, agreed to comply now. They were going to cooperate because they were all captives. And they're like, okay, well, our resistance is over. We'll comply with your rules in return for being able to conduct our own immigration to the West, to manage the monies and manage all the arrangements. Scott agreed to that, and Ross was as good as his pledge. And the idea that there were hundreds of people running around in the mountains went expressly against that pledge. Scott is writing to his superiors, and he's more focused. He doesn't write about Welch. He writes about Wachacha, TJ's ancestor. TJ was really proud of this, by the way, because he describes Wachacha as an active, powerful, full-blooded Cherokee. And then he says that Wachacha had been for some time before engaged with other Indians and designing white men, which I think would be a great name for a TV show, right? In persuading the tribe to remain in the mountains of North Carolina, further seducing others of the tribe already collected in the camps to the conspiracy of the said prisoners and associates, and fugitives were to remain concealed from the U.S. forces until they'd withdrawn. They've laid bare the whole plan. They've laid bare this whole conspiracy. And now the Army has captured the leaders. They captured the people who had the ability to hide people, give them information, and feed them. Scott sends a force into North Carolina to capture Mrs. Welch and Mrs. Wachacha and Mrs. Morris and all these folks and everybody else who's left around there. So now the Army, which had been gone from North Carolina since early July, is back. They're back on the ground. All the people who had sort of bypassed stepped back into the woods when the Army came, and are living out in the open. All of a sudden, they've got to go back into the mountains because the Army's back. The Army's coming back. They're there in August. Wachacha, meantime, becomes the only Cherokee individual who takes the federal government to court to challenge his arrest and impending deportation. He gets a lawyer, actually William Roan, who had represented them in the reserve cases, and they get a writ of habeas corpus and take him to the court in Athens. And Wachacha's case says that he has the rights and privileges of an American citizen, which he has never forfeited, and that by being imprisoned and threatened with deportation to Arkansas are violating his rights, not as a Cherokee, but as an American citizen, is his case, and that's the basis of his case. Remember, that citizenship had been upheld by the Supreme Court of North Carolina. But in the court in Tennessee, heard by George Keith, and Winfield Scott is the attorney for the federal government, arguing the case there in court. Ultimately, Wachacha's case is defeated. Winfield Scott argues that he is confessedly an alien by birth. What a strange thing to say about a Cherokee person on his own land. And so he's taken back to the brig after that. The capture of Wachacha, Junaluska, and the Welches electrified the people who were in the woods, who were in North Carolina, and also the people who were in the camps. There were a lot of people there in the camps, so their plan was they weren't going to go to Oklahoma. Their plans were to come down there under Army Guard, collect their monies that they were entitled to under the treaty, and then leave and go back home. Because they actually, a lot of them had little pieces of paper that said they could. But suddenly, all of that's invalidated by this case, or by the impending case. They have to switch to Plan B. So I'm going to throw this guy up here, like we needed a new variable, right? This guy, George Washington Hayes, shows up at Fort Cass. Now, he had been in the North Carolina troops out arresting people in June. He arrested the Standing Wolf, but he was a plant. Well, actually, he was an animal, but he spoke Cherokee. He was an interpreter. What he didn't tell him at the time is he had grown up next door to the Standing Wolf. In fact, he'd grown up with Standing Wolf almost as a substitute father. And so he goes over to Fort Cass expressly to get him out. And we know this because he published an account in a Raleigh newspaper in 1853, one of the few first-hand accounts we have from somebody on the ground like that. And he says, just accidentally, I go back to Fort Cass because I've got some business I need to take care of there. No accident. His business was delayed. He goes straight to the Rattlesnake Springs, and within minutes, he has found a standing wolf. This is no accident. He meets with the standing wolf and his wife, Waggie, and let's see. And they tell him their story, which he recounts in this newspaper story. He has their children, so they've lost children there in the camps, and if they go west, they'll all die. What can they do? This is the way he's telling the story. And he says, I don't see anything for them to do except if they escape. And that seems like a bad option, but I told them this is all they could do. But if they come back, if they return to their old home, I actually bought all their corn and they'll have the whole crop of corn. Like, these guys had planned all this out in advance. So what we see is there's these allies like Thomas and like Preston Starrett, and ultimately the superintendent of immigration is in on this, and Hayes, and all these people who have connections in the Cherokee Nation who are assisting these folks. The escape of Standing Wolf did not go under the radar. In fact, Standing Wolf escaped in a mass escape of 8 or 10 families as reported by Winfield Scott. And what he said is they'd settled their claims with the Board of Commissioners, entrusted their money with, once again, designing white men. I need to get a script for that show. To purchase land at the sales now going on, being assured that after withdrawal of the troops from this quarter, they would be allowed to cultivate such lands in quietness. Their plan actually kind of mirrors this whole reserve thing that they'd done 18 years before. Scott, of course, sends out another military expedition to chase the fugitives. So he's doubling up the forces in North Carolina. And this, with Lieutenant Larned, this becomes that last push of the Army here in North Carolina. And this is where it really goes down. Larned comes into North Carolina. He's riding around. They have mounted infantry, and they're trying to find these people on foot. There's probably 150 or 200 people who made that escape. If you think 8 or 10 families, Standing Wolf had 16 people with him. So it's a bunch of people. Larned can't find them. He can't find anybody. In his later letters, he talks about folks hiding up in laurel thickets, and every time he gets within 2 hours, they're gone. They're like ghosts. And that there are people helping them. People who have permits are helping these runaways, helping these escapees. Like the Raper folks on Notley Creek. Finally, Larned's just like, I don't know what's happened to these people. They've all gone to Qualla. So he brings his troops up here to Qualla. And he compels William Holland Thomas to assemble everybody, all of your ancestors, or I should say all of you had ancestors in this group, right? There's 333 people to line up and count off, sound off. He did this muster, and William Holland Thomas, they have a list, and that's the list, that same list from 1837, and they count off people. And what Larned doesn't know is the people he's looking for are on that list. Like the Standing Wolf. They pull a Jedi mind trick on the Army. He's standing there looking at Standing Wolf, trying to capture Standing Wolf. They sound off, and he's like, okay, you're good. And they leave him. But there's a whole lot of people out in the mountains. You know, they've heard stories about, well, there's 20 people in the mountains. Oh, there's 400 people in the mountains. They can't tell because they can't ever get close to folks. They're capturing a few people at a time, 10 or 15 here or there, and send them down to Fort Cass, but not most of the folks. I mean, we know, for instance, from the testimony of Dick Agishki, Dick Agishki was from Buffalo Town up in Graham County, okay? And he says that he's out there when the troops began collecting. He and his family kept out of the way, and he said they had a group of 100 people. But this is the time of the greatest privation for these folks, because now they're forced in the mountains with nothing to eat. It's getting late in the year, and this has been a super hard year. We're in a period in there in the 1830s, 1835 to 1839, when there's a weird climate downturn and there's food shortfalls. So these people are already sort of slightly malnourished, and they can't get to any of their food they've grown. And so they're having to forage like the sap of trees and roots. And children are dying right and left while they're hiding, and the soldiers are just everywhere, and they're staying out of their way. But one thing that Larned writes back to Scott, and this is the title of Lance's book, is all persist in their determination to remain in the mountains until the soldiers are gone. The people who are hiding there. Well, ultimately, Larned gives up. The end of October, he writes back to Winfield Scott, and he says, there's nobody here. These are all rumors. There might be 3 or 4 dozen people out, and they're not going to hurt anything. If we just leave and leave them alone, they can join in with the folks at Qualla. They'll be fine. And so he pulls his troops out, except 5 soldiers. There's 5 soldiers who are kind of bringing up the rear. They've been detached down to South Carolina, chasing Gideon Morris's family that they don't catch. And they come back up to Qualla. And they find a message at Qualla that says, "Going to Fort Cass, follow us." And they're started down there, but they get word of one family where they're hiding. And they go capture that family. Now, I want to note, these are the last soldiers. That's Solly's family. It's old Charlie. The Army's already called it off, and they capture old Charlie. And of course, what happens then is the stuff of legend. We don't know exactly what precipitated. There's a lot of argument and discussion about why. But Charlie and the boys in the group, the men, they make a bid to escape with the family. And by the end of that, there's 2 soldiers dead on the ground. A 3rd one's wounded. Their commander has ridden off, comes back. And this hits the national newspapers. It's everywhere. Because everybody's been anticipating, a guerrilla war to break out at any moment anyway. And now it's happened. And what this newspaper says is, this will no doubt terminate in the destruction of the Indians. This is what's anticipated here. And they send, in order to capture the people who've done this or do something, Winfield Scott sends Colonel William Stanhope Foster with the 4th Infantry into North Carolina. So now the soldiers have come back. Okay, and this is the beginning of November. Things are getting tough in the mountains. All these people are hiding out, and we know from different people's accounts that folks are starving, and Foster comes back. And of course, Foster, they've been trying to catch folks when there's hundreds of people out there, and now Foster's looking for one family, and they're never going to capture them. But what that means is they're never going to leave. The Army will not leave until they have captured Charlie and his whole family. It will never be over. And the people who are hiding in the mountains will starve to death through the winter because they're already starving. Ultimately, not all, this is all happening in a very short time period. William Holland Thomas goes to Foster. He's actually checked in with Winfield Scott, and he says, "I can help you end this." And they send a runner. Well, first I want you to read this because we'll bring some of these folks together. Molly Sequoia, this was published in the 60s, tells a story that she learned from Washington, who was the youngest male in that group. So this is like a first-hand account from Washington. And what she says is, once all this happened, once he got in trouble down around Bushnell, they killed the two, another one escaped, they got the horses, and they went to the Standing Wolf, who had escaped and gone back to his farm, which was close to there, and they sought counsel from him. What do we do? What do we do? Because Standing Wolf, you remember, I didn't tell you this, Standing Wolf is also the nephew of Yonaguska. He's the son of Wilnody. He's been in the middle of this from the very beginning. He knows the plan, and he knows the rules. He knows the rules that go with it. So they're in Plan B, their contingency. Thomas sends a runner, Arnich, to find Ujala. Ujala is a great leader. Ujala is the head man of Nantahala town. And as we see what Foster says, a man made himself somewhat notorious by threats of resistance. Ujala, if you remember, is Ujala versus Welch from 1824, a reserve at Cowee. And now he has more than 100 people out in the mountains, and they can't touch him. Ujala, according to how you say the name, and I'll get Gil here to help me. Apparently, if you say Ujala, it's one thing, but if you say Ujila, it's a different thing. Ujila, that it might be moss, or he might be somebody who can change shapes. I mean, he was strong. He's strong in many ways. Like I said, he's the head man of Nantahala town. Well, one story is, as he was hiding his group, the soldiers would come marching by. He'd have his group right there, and he'd stand in front of them, right beside the road. And they couldn't see him or any of the people behind him. That's quite a story that TJ told me. They're seeking the help of Ujala to settle this. Ujala's wife and son have died. They've starved to death in the mountains. Ujala has, as he said by his own account, nothing to live for but to protect these people. He was the head man of Nantahala town. His next door neighbor, who lived on the same branch, was Charlie. In fact, and this is something else TJ told me, in the community they say actually Charlie's mother and Ujala's mother were sisters, which means they're brothers. They recruit Ujala to help finish this. And Ujala says in testimony later on that they had all been instructed under no circumstances to take the life of one of the whites. What that says is somebody else is telling them what to do and what not to do. There is a plan, there's a master plan that's guiding them. Ujala brings his people together, and along with folks from Kuala, within no time, they have captured this group. These folks, names we know, Little John, Connaughts, a lot of the Eastern Band names. They have come together because here's an act that endangered everyone. It endangered the entire community because the army could never leave. We don't know what Ujala and Charlie said to each other. I'm sure for Ujala, it was an incredibly hard thing, the hardest thing he'd ever done, when his group executed Charlie and the men who'd helped him. But that's what they had to do. Not because the army said so. Of course, the army said so. The army would have executed him. But Ujala said, no, the way this is done by law, and what he means is not the written law, he means by clan law, is we take care of this. We take care of this because it has to be done. We see this in the newspaper accounts where it talks about that execution. And then, with that, it's over. Foster grants clemency, as if he had the power to grant clemency to Ujula and his people. And he says, there's nobody left here. There's nobody hiding out. There's not more than 60 people hiding out. There's only 15 or 20 grown men. He's right back to Winfield Scott, and he says, we're done. We're coming back home. And so that closes out the army in this theater. The people we've talked about here, Ujula came from Cowie. Charlie came from Cowie. John Welch, Gideon Morris, Wachacha, Yonaguska, Will Nody, Standing Wolf, they're all reservees. They all had a plan that was made in 1819 where they agreed they would go together and they put all their lands together to make a home for the community, their own communities to live. And they followed that plan all the way through. They brought in designing white men like Hayes, like Thomas, that they could trust. People like Hayes and Thomas knew what would happen if they betrayed these people, to buy land, to put this back together. And they put their communities together. They began right away, building council houses, having dances, having ball plays, holding councils. They resumed this traditional organizational structure, something that people immigrated to the West couldn't do because of their circumstances out there. You know, we don't see that reestablishment out there. These folks reestablished traditional towns. And at Thomas's suggestion, they set up this whole system of towns here, you know, Paint Town. We're in Paint Town, by the way, right now. Ujula goes to Wolftown, or actually Ujula founds Wolftown, and he's the head man of Wolftown, and he's buried up there in Blue Wing under a rock pile there. Pretty Woman Town is my favorite there. But these are towns named for the clans. But you notice they're not old town names. They give them new town names. They don't go back to their old towns because those fires, those town organizations have left. They have to start new towns. But they do. And they do this all over the place. So Joe the Sodi and Long Bear, they found Sandtown on the lands of William Seiler, who's working with them, and ultimately gives them title to the land. He holds it for them until they can get title. Welch's Town, and Lance's book covers all this. So John Welch, he's still in the brig there in early November. Wachacha has gotten away somehow. Wachacha is with Ujula's group when they find Charlie. But Welch is let out. He's gone blind from being held in prison. He contracted, a blinding illness. And he's so weak he can barely walk. And they're just like, push him out the door. Because now it's a hazard to hold him. And he walks back 80 miles across the mountains on the worst roads you can imagine, back to his home. His wife, who is white, his son-in-law, who are white, but of course they're Cherokee speakers and everything else. They've been out with the money. They bought 1,400 acres of land. And this whole community comes in out of the mountains and forms Welch's Town on that land. This happens over and over and over again with these different trusted people who can move as proxies and hold title to land for these families. And that is the genesis of the Eastern Band, to perpetuate this idea of holding these lands in common for communities and for these traditional communities. So the Cherokees, as Welch said, were determined not to abandon their country, whatever risk they might run, and obviously they ran all kinds of risks. They lost vast numbers of people in this effort. I've told you some of who and some of how they did it. It gets a lot more complicated than that, but we don't have 3 days to talk about it. Actually, we do have 3 days to talk about it only. But why? Why do they do this? Why do they hazard that risk, hazard their very lives, hazard their connections with their kin in the nation? I think that's why I would suggest to you these places, the folks at Kadua and the folks out in Cowee and down there, they live in the oldest part of the nation. They live in the place where all the holy places are, all the holy things, the most ancient of ancient things, the Jalageueti, the old country. They're there to take care of it. That's their job. Probably everybody in those camps except John Ross knew that. And this was the worst kept secret that there was. You know, it's like only John Ross and Winfield Scott don't know that they're doing this. They understand that it's their responsibility. Yonaguske, Will Nody, even John Welch, that they have to keep these places. There has to be Cherokee people here. If there's not Cherokee people on these places and around these places and watching these places and taking care of them, then there's all kinds of things that Cherokee people can't do. There's ceremony you can't do and all kinds of other things. They're here to take care of it. They're here to take care of it in 1819, in 1820, in 1838, and in 2022. Because we've witnessed this after, 90 some years, the Eastern Band purchased Kadua and brought it back. And you've all witnessed since 1996 a kind of a renaissance, a cultural renaissance in the Eastern Band, because this holy place is restored. And the Eastern Band didn't stop there. The Eastern Band has now secured and made sure that holy places like Naquasi are protected, Cowee, which the Eastern Band owns, Watauga Town. And even when the Eastern Band can't physically acquire these, the Eastern Band's working at, like Levita, renaming places like Klingman's Dome to bring back the old names, Kuwahi, to the most sacred peak in the world. So the job of these folks, whether they know it or not, whether folks in 2022 know it or not, is to put the world back together again. And I think that's what they've done. Because they've acted accordingly. I think it's an amazing story. An amazing story that the people, the ancestors of the Eastern Band, purposefully enacted and saw their way all the way through all the suffering that it took to remain here so they could do this. And with that, I'll stop, because I hadn't looked at my clock. I'm sure you have. And I want to thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have, either here or during the conference, because we're going to be all over this country tomorrow doing stuff. So thank you very much.